So, now that we have Aristotle settled, let's discuss whether Tom saved libertarians from necessary oppression. We already heard my argument at the beginning. I took from Aristotle that in order to preserve society, the ruling class should pander to the people that don't participate in ruling. With Tom's response, there is a point that I take to be central that I want to begin with. He says,
If a libertarian society is the only just form of society, saying it is unachievable because it won't be popular and people will revolt doesn't dispute, for instance, that private property rights ought to be respected or that it's wrong to initiate force against people. It is merely a dispute against the sustainability of these principles or the popularity of them. And hence, becoming a liberal or adopting a new position rather than trying to pragmatize your own is not rational.
See, Tom, this ends up at my point. If a libertarian society is unachievable and there are people that are libertarians, then the oppression of libertarians is necessary. Maybe a better word is inevitable. If I am disputing the sustainability of libertarian principles, then if I am right, then eventually a libertarian society will become something else and libertarians will be oppressed. We might say that all societies eventually come to an end, and that's fine enough, but I'm suggesting the idea that is apparently crazy, that libertarians might want to preserve their society as long as possible, and that it would be wise to pander to the people that are not in the ruling class, which in a libertarian society would likely be the people without property. I think you were closer to a better response to my point with the brief aside about the distinction between government and society that you made at the end of your speech. I think a better response to my point seems to be that the wealthiest people should freely take it upon themselves to pander to the people without property. That's not an original idea from me. But I suppose this would be a chicken or the egg problem, since the question couldn't be resolved whether these wealthy benefactors were public-spirited because of their own free will or because they were aware of the threat posed by the proletariat. Or rather, if it was because of their free will, our knowledge of that about them would always be questionable, whereas if they were actually caving to pressure, it could be known in a way that is more satisfying. However, for the public-spirited benefactor to continue without it devolving into what I am imagining, that is, a system based on that loathsome idea of taxation, these wealthy benefactors would have to do it out of free will. They would have to be something like Plato's philosopher-kings. But as we should take from Plato's Republic, the philosopher and the king are two different people. The person that pursues knowledge is essentially different from the person that pursues power, and we are quite unlikely to find both in one person. And aside from that, there is a line that I think I take from Edmund Burke that the problem with kings is replacing them, and that good kings are rare. I just want to bring up the point about libertarians having a higher IQ than everyone else again. There could only be a libertarian society in the sense of a society that is run by libertarians. But a society that allows everyone the freedom to more or less do what they want also allows people the freedom to be tyrants, which I mean in the Greek sense, a charismatic figure that uses speech to rouse people's passions and assume power. Now, don't get me wrong, I want people to live freely, but freedom is problematic. It's like Leo Strauss says about justice, that the political question par excellence is how to reconcile order, which is not oppression, with freedom, which is not license. So, even if a society had a free market that allowed everyone to succeed and acquire wealth according to their merits, the wealthy would still have to pander to the poor, and the smart would still have to pander to the stupid. Anyway, Tom continues.
This is a point that can be made in all directions. As long as someone ideologically opposes you, you can make the partial threat that people on your side or who are incompatible with their ethical views will revolt against them.
That's right. This is a point that can be made in all directions, and I'm making it about libertarians. I think this might be important because I never suggested that I have come up with a philosophy that someone can have and never be oppressed. As I'll explain, justice is problematic. Anyway, let's backtrack to a few parts I skipped.
When you, Derek, say justice necessitates the oppression of libertarians, Would you feel at all persuaded if I followed up with, well, you'll be running the risk of a revolution then? If the libertarians became popular enough that 1776 was going to rise again in the wake of your redistributionist policies, would you become a libertarian?
Here, Tom is more or less asking me, if libertarians weren't the ruling class, would I pander to libertarians? Yes, I certainly believe that I would, and in fact, I am more or less in that situation in real life. I support free markets, I'm into Austrian economics, but I'm more socially conservative, and so most of the libertarian agenda doesn't move me. But I'd be satisfied to accept much of it just because libertarians are kind of annoying with their blend of sanctimony and idealism that basically rejects every existing society. For an example, I'd accept a moderate program of drug legalization. I'd want to work out some sort of compromise, but if libertarians would just shut up about it, that would probably be enough to bring me to the table. Then Tom says,
I would imagine you would want to implement a means in which to protect yourself that doesn't sacrifice your principles in the process.
I will sacrifice a lot of principles because I'm into Platonism, according to which, like I said, perfect justice is only achievable in theory, and not really even then. I could say that one of my significant principles is to preserve society, but what I'll go with that I wouldn't sacrifice is what I call acceptableism. I have in mind what Socrates says in Plato's Republic that you can find all regimes in a democracy. Socrates was satisfied to live in the Athenian democracy, and he was satisfied to be condemned to death merely for being a pain in the ass, because he found life in Athens acceptable, even though he and Plato may be the all-time greatest critics of democracy. I very much identify with that. Also, I have in mind a line from Dennis Prager that if nothing's horrific, then life is terrific. Anyway, a little later, Tom says,
As revolutions are, as you suggest, the result of popular belief, not true virtue or principle. People only need to think they're being treated wrongly, and hence the only ideological solution that can abide by your assertion is to adopt cultural relativism, to believe that the most just policies are those that reflect the popular belief of a society. That is the position that you should adopt if your goal is to prevent revolutions through being empathetic rather than through enforcing real justice.
so there is quite a lot that needs to be said about this, and I'm not going to say all of it now, but first of all, I'm into Straussianism, or Platonism, which considers the philosophic life to be the most noble, but also knows that the philosopher's superior knowledge of how society should be run makes him a threat to every existing society, and so his political priority is what I call acceptability. For the philosopher, a society is acceptable if he can practice philosophy. Since an acceptable society is more rare than is usually believed in our time, preserving an acceptable society is a subject that a philosopher considers to be quite interesting. Second, since the philosopher has superior knowledge of how a society should be run, he is an enemy of all societies that actually exist, and he may or may not be into cultural relativism, depending on whether cultural relativism really has merit. Platonists, though, are not into moral relativism. We consider the philosophical life to be the most noble, and for society, we consider justice to be the common good, which we might measure on a scale of psychological health or happiness. The question isn't whether any given person is happy, but whether society as a whole is happy. Of course, the greatest happiness belongs to the philosopher, and that kind of happiness is not available to society generally. Put briefly, this view of justice as the common good follows a cost-benefit analysis. Macro justice is a combination of justice and injustice. Although this certainly requires much more explanation for another time, I will say that the very notion of a moral cost-benefit analysis is contrary to moral relativism, since I am saying that there are actual costs and actual bennies. And again, the philosopher wants to exist, so he doesn't really want to live in the best society, since that can't exist. But he has the best society in mind because he wants his acceptable society to continue to exist, and acceptable society could learn from the best society. So, having the conception of a best society or a best way to live is contrary to moral relativism. But one of the reasons I seem to be vulnerable to the charge of moral relativism is that when I speak about preserving society, I seem to be giving advice equally to kings and to tyrants, or, as you said, the point that I am making can be made in all directions. But I don't really do that. That isn't really my mindset. That is why I begin my videos with a disclaimer. The ideas in my videos are only suitable for relatively sober thinkers. Anyone that is ruled by their passions may be prone to tyranny. Like Plato's Socrates suggests in his Phaedrus, a published work, in his case he was referring to a writing, communicates the same message to everyone that consumes it. YouTube videos apparently have this same limitation, but that doesn't mean that only moral relativists can make YouTube videos about how to preserve power abstracted from considerations of ideology. In a personal conversation, I would be less inclined to give a tyrant advice about how to preserve power than I would with a fine ruler. In fact, I might explain to a tyrant why it is that I consider him to be a tyrant and not a fine ruler. Of course, him being a tyrant, saying that to him poses a risk to my safety, and my willingness to do so requires a cost-benefit analysis with regard to myself becoming a tyrant or a victim of a tyrant. In Plato's Gorgias, his Socrates says he'd rather be the latter. He'd rather be a victim of a tyrant, and believe me, my big mouth has gotten me some victim of a tyrant credentials. But I plan on making as many YouTube videos as I have time for, and I have already made a bunch that don't have the ethically ambiguous aspect of preserving power abstracted from any particular ethical doctrine to them. So, your criticism of the relativistic aspect of my video ties into your criticism of my use of Aristotle this way. You treat my YouTube video as though it's a universe unto itself, as though it's all that exists, or as though it and the response videos it is linked to are all that exists. It's just a little funny because to defend myself against the charge of relativism, all I have to do is show up and condemn something and say it's not just my opinion. But really, you didn't even consider my video as a whole. You considered it in separate parts. It is strange to reduce my argument in the first half to moral relativism, since in the second half I rejected the idea that justice is power, an idea which is frequently associated with moral relativism, and for good reason. Actually, I'd say that you associate that view with moral relativism in your videos on democracy and cultural relativism when you say that moral relativists should just consult polls to find out what is right. That is, they should consult the majority. Something is right because the majority of people says so. That is, something is right because of power. Sadly, you seem to dismiss this part of my video because of a mistake that I made changing a word you said, sufficient to necessary, which, of course, wasn't actually relevant to the argument I was making, and I left a comment about that on your video. And then, with Aristotle, someone isn't going to name drop Aristotle for no apparent reason in the beginning of a response video to that guy T unless they are prepared to go to the mat. Especially when he concludes the video throwing down the gauntlet saying, like I did, that liberalism and libertarianism are products of modern philosophy, and I am satisfied that classical philosophy, and especially Plato and Aristotle, are just far superior. And by the way, if you neglected these things because you were trying to bait me, to bait me, sounds like debate. If it was because you were trying to bait me, that's fine, and I appreciate the opportunity and the education that I am about to receive. Anyway, let's address one more point from Tom.
If free markets are in fact beneficial for everyone, that self-interest isn't being preserved through parasitism, free riding, or etc., then such a revolt is unfounded, and hence I would speculate to say has a low likelihood, although definitely in the realm of possibility, in the very fallible but still literate and prosperous Western world.
I disagree. I think what you've done is assign to me the Marxist conception of revolution, which I admittedly bait with my use of the term proletarian, whereas I actually hold Aristotle's view of revolution, for which the standard is a change in the politeia. According to this view, we would consider the New Deal in America to have been a revolution. The word revolution is used this way in the phrase Reagan Revolution. So I take Aristotle's quote to mean that the ruling class should pander to those outside the ruling class in order to preserve society. I don't know how it can be denied that this applies to our time with Brexit and the rise of nationalism in Europe following pro-immigrant policies. These things are happening because many Europeans are feeling excluded from the ruling class in favor of people that aren't even from their society. Even the immigration aspect is straight out of Aristotle's Politics, since he discusses the consequences of changing the citizens in a polis. Consider the civil rights movement in America in the 1960s. Hippies are pretty much wrong about everything, but they got an easy issue from which to spring to international megastardom, and now they have and have had serious amounts of power and try to implement some sort of tyranny. The United States is basically being tyrannized by a perpetual reenactment of the civil rights movement. The one issue hippies have ever been right about, an incredibly obvious issue, and maybe this could have been avoided if black people had just been treated better sooner. I heard Ben Shapiro suggest on Dave Rubin's show that this might have happened if the Supreme Court had ruled correctly in Plessy in 1896. Then there is the recent election of Donald Trump. Since the election, we might as well have heard people quoting my line from Aristotle endlessly. It's standard fare to say that Trump voters were activated by resentment at being left out of the governing class. If the hippies had just pandered to these people, they might have avoided this fate. Really, it is a political dynamic more or less applicable to all times that resembles what you mentioned in your democracy video about each society consisting of several societies. Anyway, I think you live in Australia, and I think it's pretty cool that all the YouTubers from Australia and New Zealand are pretty familiar with American politics, but I'm sorry if I've made any comments that are more understandable for an American audience. For instance, in my last video, I referred to Stephen Douglas. Also, I'm not sure if Straussianism is known much in your part of the world. It isn't even known much in America, although I have heard of it in Europe, but I haven't heard of it from your part of the world. I'm not demanding that you keep going back and forth with me in YouTube response videos, although please make a response if you want. Like I said, if you've baited me, then I'm happy to be educated, but you gave us a glimpse of your solid quarry, and you have some sort of penguin edition of Plato's Republic. Bro, you want Alan Bloom's translation of the Republic. Right here. Alan Bloom's translation of the Republic, and you don't just want it for the translation, but also for the interpretive essay at the back. And also, you want something like Leo Strauss's The City and Man, right? Which in his essay also on Plato's Republic. So maybe I'm wrong, but I'm going to suppose that you haven't considered the pro-democratic aspect of the Republic yet. The ideal city is a satire. It can't actually exist. And Plato wants to actually be a philosopher, and his Socrates says that you will find every regime in a democracy. But every regime includes the tyrant, so philosophy and justice are problematic. Aside from doing a response video, I can suggest some general subjects that I'd like you to weigh in on. Why don't you Strauss it up, bro? Or, why do you think people have rights, bro? If Aristotle is far from an authority on contemporary political philosophy, and everyone goes around insisting that people have rights, then there must be some legitimate rights doctrine. Maybe you don't think there is a legitimate rights doctrine. I don't think people have rights because I'm into situational ethics. You can watch my video, Why Do You Think People Have Rights, Bro?, to anticipate my criticisms. And as for Strauss, I didn't mention Strauss in my necessary oppression video, but I have to figure that you are not familiar with Strauss. It's not a moral failing or anything. And no, I'm not a grand master, and I'm sure there are fine thinkers that I am not familiar with, but Just so you know, when someone says that they are not a liberal or libertarian because they think that Plato and Aristotle are far superior, that reeks of Straussianism. Anyway, Straussianism is superior to libertarianism a fortiori. It is in a stronger position historically. Oh, here's a subject for you. What are your objections to continental philosophy? It seems to me as though libertarianism isn't really an alternative to continental philosophy, but rather, if you equate libertarianism with classical liberalism in this context, continental philosophy is sort of a development of classical liberalism. It doesn't suffice opposing moral relativism on the basis that moral relativists are hypocrites, as you do in your video on cultural relativism. If nothing is actually good or bad, then they can go ahead and be hypocrites. To my knowledge, the only satisfying criticism is from Plato and Aristotle and, well, from Strauss. Actually, your objecting to moral relativism on the basis of hypocrisy points to the pre-scientific understanding of Plato and Aristotle. So, step up your game, libertarians. First of all, you pretty much never meet a libertarian that has heard of Strauss. And second, when you do, all they have to say is, Leo Strauss, the war in Iraq, neocons, 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 neocons. Straussianism is an alternative to continental philosophy. It is a type of philosophy. The Iraq War has nothing to do with whether or not Straussianism has merit. I just think it would be great if I found a libertarian that actually knew how to address Straussianism. Straussianism allows for quite a lot of views. I think for the most part, most of us accept Austrian economics, so if any of you libertarians want to hit me with your Austrian perspective, I'll just be like, yeah, faux show. That isn't what I'm disputing. What I'm disputing is more along the lines of the conception of justice, the rights doctrine, and the non-aggression principle, which obviously I know now that you don't accept the non-aggression principle. And personally, I think that I could live in a society ruled by libertarians and be happy. But if philosophy rules the day, prepare for your Straussian overlords.